Call me Sonic 2K, though. I'm telling you what to say. Hey, everybody, what's up? Welcome back to the Games Kids. Today, and only today, we are here to talk a little bit about Sonic in the 2000s. Now, I've, obviously talked a little bit about that era, when I talked about my video about Sonic style, and obviously, my video talked about my nostalgia growing up with Sonic, but I want to focus this video primarily on the 2000s of Sonic, mainly because literally today, Sonic Twitter changed their entire aesthetic on their socials to match the 2000s. Now, they've been doing this to celebrate each era of Sonic, like they just finished doing the 2010s era, and now they have moved to the 2000s. So it just kind of got me thinking. I wanted to talk a little bit about, why this era was so special for a lot of people, why it was so important for a lot of people. Even with the good and the bad, it is a really pivotal, I think, time that Sonic went through that really changed the entire series' life, and I think I would say it had the biggest, most major impact on the series, and again, for better or worse. So let's sit down, yap a little bit, make sure to subscribe to your boys, support the content, and let's get right into this. First thing I want to say is I feel like, and a lot of people can, let me know in the comments below, I think the 2000s was the last era for video games, before 2010s to 2020s, where it felt like games took a lot longer to make, right? It felt like, in the 2000s, we were getting sequels to games extremely quicker, right? You were getting them, within 2, max 3 years, right? Whereas, now you see in the 2010s and, 2020s era, games have a much larger development cycle. And I think because of this, a lot of series were actually able to pump out a lot more games, again, for better or worse. But this allowed people to get extremely attached to a lot of franchises. I saw a video or like a tweet that was saying how Dragon Quest or FF fans are having a hard time being attached to the series because there's such a long gap between games nowadays, right? I even saw a tweet about someone saying how Odyssey came out in 2017 and now their kid is a grown person since the last mainline 3D Mario game, right? 2017 to 20, what are we, 2026? It's been 9 years since the last 3D Mario. Like, that's a long time, to go through without a game, where it felt like in the 2000s we were getting multiple mainline FFs, multiple mainline Sonics, multiple mainline Marios, and it just felt like, think about it, right? Within the 2000 to 2010, right, even on the Mario side, right, we got Sunshine, Galaxy, and I think, did we get Galaxy too? I'm not sure. I actually have to look that up. We did. We got Galaxy in exactly 2010, which, not really counts, but you know what I mean. Still 3 major games within a decade. And of course, Sonic is no stranger to that. The first thing I wanted to touch on was one of the big reasons Sonic fans are so attached to the 2000s era is because of the sheer amount of Sonic series and sub-series that were popular and big and came out during this time. First of all, the adventure games, right? Obviously now adventure came out in 99, right? But I do think a lot of people's first major, adventure and introduction to adventure was the DX port available on GameCube and multiple platforms, as well as Sonic Adventure 2 available on GameCube, PlayStation. I don't know if it was on Xbox, but primarily, those two were the major platforms. And, that was one sub-series that obviously took over for the longest time. That was a massive popularity hit for the series. You could argue one of the biggest highs in terms of the series. You then had the Rush series and the Advanced series actually on the handheld side. Nintendo was finally working with Sonic. Well, not necessarily working, but they were finally releasing Sonic games on Nintendo devices. So on the Game Boy Advance, you got 3 Sonic games. You got Sonic Advance, Sonic Advance 2, and Sonic Advance 3, and you got Sonic Battle, and we had the shitty Sonic 1 port, but that's not a good one. But again, that was like 5 games of Sonic that were available on your Game Boy Advance, and then you got to the DS, right? And the DS ended up getting, a game like Sonic Rush. You obviously had a game like Sonic Rush Adventure, right? You even had Mario and Sonic Olympic games in the DS in the in the 2000s era. Like, they were working on this stuff. Not to mention, we also had the Riders series. That was a sub-series of, racing that was introduced, and that, had its own style and flavor. And we'll talk about style in just a little bit. But you had the introduction of the Riders series, which people ended up falling in love with, for better or worse. You had your one-off games like Sonic Heroes, which, ended up being one of the most popular games in the entire franchise to this day, with about 4 million copies sold. It was actually the most sold 3D Sonic game until Sonic Frontiers came out. You also had weird games like Shadow the Hedgehog. And then, you know, even though we got stuff like 06, right? 2 years later, we got a game like Unleash. And then we even had Sonic Rivals as a franchise on the PSP. We had Sonic in Brawl, right? We had, you know, Sonic, what's it called? Am I missing one? I feel like I've gotten everything. We had the Sonic Storybook games on the Wii. Like, the sheer volume of Sonic games available on the, you know, 2000s era was unbelievable. I think that's about like, you know, 15 to 20 like notable Sonic games that came out at the time. And so, while obviously the quality of these varied, and you know, we'll talk about that a little bit later, it felt like that was a major time for you to like be invested in this series. I mean, if you had a Game Boy, you had so many options for Sonic. If you had a GameCube, you had so many options for Sonic. Not only just, you know, Adventure 1 and 2, which is how I grew up with it, but even stuff like the Mega Collection or, you know, the Dreams Collection, whichever the collections were, the Gems Collection, where, you know, you had old school Sonic games you could get into. I mean, that was how I got into Sonic and fell in love with the series. I remember, you know, that cross synergy of Sonic marketing where I was watching Sonic X on TV, you know, and then I wanted Sonic Adventure, right, which ended up coming out, and then, you know, Sonic Adventure 2, which I ended up falling in love with, and again, I had the Sonic Advance games, and it's like, this alone, yeah, I'm not saying that video games or Sonic needs to do this again, but like, this is one of the major first reasons that Sonic ended up being so popular in the 2000s, especially like amongst hardcore fans. It's just like, it felt like there was so much going on at once, and something I miss, you know what I mean? I'm not saying I need 50 different games, but like the amount of different sub-series that were introduced, there's a reason why nowadays people ask for so many. It's because so many of those series started in the 2000s. And of course, you know, we cannot talk about the 2000s, which I think this is the heavy carry of the conversation where it goes, the aesthetic and style, right? I think that is a massive conversation point when people talk about the 2000s. It's the reason that, you know, when like they change their social medias to, you know, the 2000s theme, people are freaking out and they're so excited. It's because in the 2000s, and I think everybody kind of agrees, it was the pinnacle of Sonic being cool, right? It was all in on like the attitude, like the difference, and like, yo, Sonic's type of way of talking with everybody. Oh yeah, let's do this, let's go. Whoa, so cool. Like that kind of attitude, not just in the behavior of Sonic and his friends, right? But in the aesthetic and look of the games, right? You know, they were different, right? They went with this like realistic look that had a bit of, you know, anime style to it, right? You know, they had all these things like your city escapes, right? Or your vocal themes, like your live and learns that take over the series, right? You have Hideki working on the soundtrack of the Sonic Rush games. You have these beautiful sprites on the GBA that there were some of actually the best sprites on the GBA that people really ended up falling in love with, right? And of course, again, you have stuff like Sonic Unleashed, which to this day is still one of the best looking Sonic games in the entire franchise. And for 06, for as many problems as 06 has, that game did go for a unique aesthetic in terms of, you know, like the destroyed world mixed with Sonic characters, right? Obviously, you know, we have the Storybook series, which they were very experimental with their look, you know, where you're going into, you know, these Arabic areas, or, you know, Sonic and the Black Knight, you're going more medieval. And, you know, with Sonic Heroes, you have arguably what is the best art direction, I feel, personally, for the series. As someone who's not necessarily a fan of that game, I always can acknowledge that like the art direction for that game in terms of the Sonic level aesthetics is pretty fantastic. So you pair some banger music, that 2000 style that we don't necessarily see today, and also like, let's be honest, nostalgia, right? If you look at the numbers, you know, the stats of the age of people watching my videos, even, it's a lot of people that basically have now grown up with Sonic. You know, it's people in their 20s, right? Or, you know, 25 to 30, which are like people that grew up with the series, and a lot of them, their nostalgia and growth came from that 2000s era. And the reason it is so strong is, again, because that is when there was so many franchises and sub-series interests. I mean, Sonic Riders to this day has such, I think that is the coolest that Sonic has ever felt in the entirety of the franchise. There's something about, you know, the way the characters are designed, the way the trailers are presented, the music, like the look of the trailers, you know, there's something about that vibe and look and style that is just so like tethered to the 2000s that you just cannot match that. You could do something different, which I always appreciate, and we're going to talk about that, but there's something about that style that like you cannot really match. Of course, a massive part of why the 2000s for Sonic was so notable was Sonic X, right? Sonic X, for better or worse, you know, I know it's funny, until you grow up and someone tells you, you don't know what's wrong with Sonic X. I used to think Sonic X was like the most peak thing ever, and then you grow up, right, and you have people talking to you about and like pointing out the animation flaws, right, or the fact that, you know, the translation in the West isn't the best, you know, or like 4Kids in general had awful you know, dubs, right? And when you watch it as a kid, you're just like, this is the coolest thing ever, right? But I think that was enough for people. You know what I mean? Like back then, Sonic X did incredibly well on 4Kids. It was one of the most popular shows. They had the main slot on a lot of days. You know, the theme song, obviously, Gotta Go Fast, like ended up being the tagline of the entire series for what felt like, you know, almost 15 plus years. To this day, we almost see that catch line be the most iconic for the series. But that was a show that meant a lot to people, especially as 4Kids was rising in popularity. You know, anime was getting popular in the West. You got Sonic X, which was meant for a younger audience. You know, obviously it wasn't a One Piece or a Dragon Ball, right? But it was in that younger demographic of anime, slice of life / shonen, where it was super, super cool. Now, again, obviously you watch it nowadays and you realize, you know, some of the translations are rough, right? Or the cuts are weird, or the censorship is odd. But back then when you saw it, it meant something to you, man. It felt like, you know, the voice acting is how you recognize those characters for such a long time, right? The way the characters acted, right? Even just having the full Sonic cast as a group together was something that was so cool and pivotal to the 2000s, right? I feel like that's a major part of the 2000s, you know? It just felt like it was the whole cast and party, you know, before we sort of got to that 2010s time where it felt like we were sort of regressing back. So it just felt like we had a lot of the personality shine through, you know, the characters through Sonic X. And, you know, again, for better or worse, it did do a lot in terms of Sonic's popularity and how we liked him a lot when we were younger. It also was like the last time we had a Sonic proper anime, right? Because after that, they had Sonic Boom, which was more like, you know, kids cartoon, and even like Sonic Prime that leaned a little bit more into like younger side 3D animation. Like this was the last time that like Japan basically took a shot at a Sonic anime. And again, we've had our nice animated shorts on YouTube that have sort of brought that vibe back, like, you know, like the dark beginnings with Shadow Jans, or even, you know, the cool opening they did for Crossroads. But here's hoping to that return one day. A massive component of the 2000s that made it so special was also the rise of the internet. You know, this was before, you know, Twitter and social media discussions were really rampant. And so the growth of Sonic on the internet was kind of unbelievably cool. Like we were starting to see Sonic not just be a, you know, massive thing throughout the fandom, like, you know, in games, but like through fans right away. As soon as the internet started getting popular, we started seeing Sonic grow on the internet. You know what I mean? Like obviously we can look back at series like Final Fantasy Sonic, right, that people just love to their core, you know, which was like a fan game that mixed, you know, the style of FF with Sonic, right? You had like Sonic Advanced Flash, which I actually, funny enough, just took advanced levels and put them on a browser game, which I thought was really hysterical, right? You had popular internet shows like Super Mario Bros. Z, right? You had a bunch of fan sprite animations and battles that people were using thanks to the advanced game sprites. Like it was so cool to be on the internet at that time and starting to see all these like Sonic fan games and early projects that were going on, including even like whole fan games you could play. That was sort of unbelievable to see at the time. It was really before the rise of, you know, fan games and modding and everything, where like Sonic was really felt like it was at the forefront of internet culture. You know, I felt like the fans rapidly wanted to go and start talking about it, you know, and even YouTube, all the meme videos, the parodies, and, you know, all the AMVs that came out of Sonic at the time were so cool and nostalgic now looking back at them, you know, which is why I like doing the Sonic Talent Show, to bring back that vibe. But I think right? That, you know, obviously towards the second half of the 2000s, when we had more internet stuff, right, going on, you know, and more people were having discourse, and reviews for Sonic started popping up, and discussion started getting a little bit more rampant. That's kind of when it felt like, okay, discussing Sonic on the internet was, you know, for me, I have a lot of fun doing it. I have a lot of positive experience, you know, with your guys in the comments and everything. But, you know, obviously it started a big wave on the internet of hate and love for Sonic. But I felt like that was later. It still did feel like in the 2000s, because the internet wasn't what it is today. It was mainly a place for sharing what you really loved and cared about for this franchise, whether it was fan art, whether it was some, like, you know, old school, you know, videos. There's even, what's that famous series that people love where it has the fusion of Sonic and Shadow together? Like, there was that series going on. Like, it was Not So Unleashed, right? It's like, there's so many things about the 2000s that, like, people really fell in love with and stuck to a lot of people, you know. And obviously that's not to take away from the stuff that's been coming out today, but something about those early beginnings of the internet, we will quite literally never see again. But while there was plenty of good to be had with the 2000s, there was definitely a lot of bad. You know, obviously, I think a big breaking point was right in the middle of the 2000s with Sonic 06, right? I feel like that was the moment, right? I feel like that was the heel turn, because previously we had, you know, like I said, Adventure 1 and 2, which I felt like, even though maybe critically weren't the greatest things, fans, it felt like people, the general public, liked them. They even had that seal, especially Sonic Adventure 2, had that seal on the GameCube of, like, you know, bestseller, fan favorite on the box art, right? You know, people really love that. And Heroes, again, becomes the best-selling game in the franchise for the longest time. You know, as much as I find that game super fun, people really loved it. But then you get that little heel turn right in the middle where Shadow the Hedgehog comes out, where people are like, okay, this is a little weird, but it's a spin-off. I can live with this. And then boom, Sonic 06 comes through just with a knife and causes, I feel like, a tunnel effect. You know, a spinning effect that, like, basically lasted, I would say, about like 5 years for Sonic Team, where it damaged a lot of them, because even a game that we love, like Sonic Unleashed, that came out 2 years later, which it's crazy to think Sonic Unleashed came out 2 years after 06, for as great as that game is and people really love it and appreciate it now, back then, again, because of the state of Sonic after 06, it was so easy to make fun of. It was easy to make fun of him, you know, for kissing a girl and you know, or, you know, being a werehog, right? Oh, like, why is he a werehog, you know? And then even the games like Secret Rings and Black Knight, right? While they were a peak aesthetic, they were on the Wii. It was easy to make fun of the janky controls. And it's funny, like, if you think about it, like, after those games, things kind of cleared up very quickly. Like, you have a game like Sonic Colors that comes out in the 2010s, and as well as Generations, like, things like it feels like things clear up a bit, but that little chunk in the 2000s definitely shifted the perspective. But it always did feel, right, like no matter what during that era, the idea was that no matter what, Sonic needs to be cool. I feel like that was almost like a corporate mandate, right? Like Sonic and the Black Knight, make him as cool as he's gotta be, right? Sonic Unleashed, make him as cool as he's gotta be, right? Sonic in the series, make him awesome, right? Make him have attitude in Heroes, you know? Like, there is so many moments in the series where you really feel like no matter what, it always felt like Sonic was in character, and there wasn't this big debate about how he's, you know, depicted and characterized. Again, these debates probably still happen, and they happen nowadays, but at the time, things felt safer. And also, we did have a major moment for Sonic in the 2000s, and that was, you know, the convergence with Nintendo, right? I mean, Sonic in Brawl, I cannot understate how massive of a deal that was. I mean, that was one of the biggest shocking reveals of the game, as well as at the time Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, becoming a series where Mario and Sonic became popular together. And honestly, the first two Mario and Sonic at the games at the Olympic Games were actually very popular. They sold a lot of copies at the time. I think it was like a few million during the Wii era. And again, that was a big deal, man. You know, on top of the fact that Nintendo and Sega had already had a good relationship because Sonic games were selling well on GameCube and you know, GBA and the DS, like, they clearly were working together at that time to make things work. And I gotta say, man, like, I gotta respect for, as you know, as much as they pumped out, right, And for as many flaws as there were, whether it was the heroes and the storybook stuff, I really do commend them for like having so many franchises within Sonic like pop up and bloom. Because like you think about nowadays, right? Like what are the Sonic sub-series going on subsequently at once, right? Like nothing. Right? I mean, we have Frontiers, which again I adore, but like we don't know if Sonic Frontiers is like, you know, gonna be a Frontiers 2, right? We have Superstars, but like we're not getting like this main, like it's not like we know we're getting a Superstars 2. We might get another Sonic game, right? Who knows, right? We have Crossroads, which again, like doesn't seem like we're getting a sequel. We might Monday get a different Sonic game, but it's not the same, right? Where like back then we had multiple sub-series to look forward to. Like we had the Rush style, right? Which, you know, with Colors DS ended up kind of being a Rush 3, right? Like I said, we had the adventure games, which is a style to look forward to, right? You had the storybook games, which are like an aesthetic to look forward to. And so I feel like while not everything always worked out, right? And I don't think it is possible, nor should they stretch themselves thin, because video game development changed as well, right? At the time, you know, handheld and console, we had separate dev teams, separate development consoles, you know, separate development time. But now everything is consolidated, right? Whether it's because of Nintendo, I mean, technically it is Nintendo's fault because of the Switch, right? But everything is consolidated now. You know, everybody is making their own handheld portable that's compatible with console. So there is no second device where another series can find life, or another like a graphical style can be, you know, played with. Everything sort of has to be worked on the same console and take a lot of the time that it needs to, which again I think is okay, right? But at the same time, you know, it takes away from experimentation. I think this is beyond a Sonic problem, right? I think there's an issue with the games industry, right? Like inherently, because games are taking so much longer to make, right? It lacks that sort of like testing, like, oh, let's fuck around and just try this. Let's try these little things out there and see what happens. And even if it doesn't work, we tried. And some people will like it, some people won't. But at least we had the time and budget and, you know, moments to do all that stuff. Now, one thing I want to talk about that I find is very important is, what do I want from this era of the 2000s to come back, right? Because I think it is important to let every era grow on its own, right? You know, I did see recently when they were doing the 2010 celebration that there was a lot of people that said like, well, that was the era I grew up with. Because if you think about this, you got to look about it this way, guys, right? Someone that was born in 2006, right? That, you know, by the time they were 4 years old was 2010. They're 20 years old now. You know what I mean? They're growing up with Generations, Colors, you know, Lost World, Forces, for better or worse, you know, and even Mania, right? And now Frontiers, you know, there's people that have now grown up with a different era of Sonic, and that's okay, right? Every era is allowed to grow, just like the 2020s now we are seeing is the era of, you know, Sonic's resurgence of cool, but it's also different. Like, it's a bit of a different Sonic. You know, we have massive multimedia projects. We have the Sonic movie going on right now, which is massive. We have Sonic Frontiers, which is a brand new formula, right? We have Crossroads, which is like a successful spin-off for the first time in a while. Now 2D, we're not really sure where it's gonna go. And let's be honest, Sega is no stranger to, you know, some nostalgia pandering, right? We literally just had the Year of Shadow, which was all glazing, you know, basically the 2000s. You know, your Radical Highway, right? Your, you know, Space Colony Arcs, right? Black Doom, like all that stuff from the 2000s, as well as, you know, the constant return to old stuff. I'm not saying I want all my old things to come back, but here's some things I would like to see from the 2000s come back. Number one, I do want to see the return of modern Sonic in 2D, right? I think a modern 2D Sonic game feels like something they were heavily invested in the 2000s, and I'd like to see that, you know, come back, because what does that look like today, right? What does a full Sonic Rush game look like on modern hardware with the boost formula, you know, with what they've learned, their expertise, even, you know, 2D sections that they've done in modern 3D games? Like, what does that look like, and how can they make that unique with a unique style and a unique look, right? Whether it was a game like an Advance or it was a Sonic Rush game, it did feel like there was an identity, and it did feel like 2D Sonic was moving forward, right? It didn't just feel like, okay, we're just gonna do the classics. It felt like we were trying to evolve and move 2D Sonic forward rather than make classic Sonic like classic Sonic, you know, like make it purposely old school Sonic, which like I feel like Nintendo did a lot in the 2010s, and it caught up to them and people made fun of it a lot. Like New Super Mario Bros, New Super Mario Bros U, New Super Mario Bros 2, right? Let's like New Super Mario Bros DS. Like it felt like, all right, we're not pushing 2D Mario forward, and that's why like when Wonder came out, that felt like such a breath of fresh air, because like, holy shit, like, okay, we are finally moving 2D Wonder, Mario to a different direction with 2D. And that's something I want to see come back with Sonic, is that, reattempt at letting modern Sonic be a 2D game. Number 2, and again, I don't think this is something that will happen, but I'd like to see it. I do want a bit of that style of aesthetic, right? There was an aesthetic look to Sonic levels that I felt like was very specific to the 2000s, right? And it was this really unique blend of like realistic areas with like cartoony, like I feel like City Escape, right, is such a good example of like that is just San Francisco, but the way it's designed and feels is very, Sonic like, right? Or even, I think of levels like, Water Palace, right? From Sonic Rush. That's a level that, is just, it's standard white pillars, but there's something about the vibe of it that's just so good. I mean, any area from Sonic Heroes is such a good example of this. Like, Rail Canyon is just literally a canyon, but the way the rails are designed around it feels very Sonic, right? Or if you get to the hang castle, is that what it's called? Like, you have this haunted mansion aesthetic to it. Like, I want them to go back, or something like a Pumpkin Hill, right? Which is such an incredibly unique look and vibe to a level, right? I feel like I want more of that to come back. Like, give me more areas that feel like it's still a cartoon, like anime world, but translated with that realism mixed with Sonic. I feel like we haven't had that in a minute, and it's something that I'd like to see them, jump back into a lot more. And the number one most important thing that I want to see again, I want to see a return of soundtrack experimentation, right? It does feel like, while I adore the vocal themes from Frontiers, and I actually adore a lot of the Frontiers OST, it does feel like, whether it's Superstars with a little bit of a stale OST, or the heavy EDM they've been going into with, Crossworlds, Frontiers, and even Forces, it does feel like they've sort of like trapped themselves in some limited styles, although again they have had fantastic songs, and I want them to continue experimenting with songs. But one thing that I really liked about the 2000s, right, was that sort of like, all right, we're gonna let Hideki make a really unique soundtrack, right, for these, Sonic games, on the DS, right? Okay, for, Sonic Adventure 2, we're gonna make, or Sonic Adventure and Adventure 2, we're gonna make sure each character has a type of music, that we give them, right? It's like stuff like that. I want that more experimental style with the music to go down, because like that felt like something that Sonic was so unique to, and it's still unique to. I still think Sonic music is some of the most unmatched in games media, but I wanted to see push a little bit more. But one thing I don't want to see in the 2000s era come back is the excessiveness, right, of it all. Because like I said earlier, at the time, it did feel like it was awesome to get all these Sonic things, but obviously, when you grow up, you see stuff like reviews or how it affected and hurt the series. You don't necessarily want that nowadays. I do want a bit more quality control, right? So while I want to see new subseries, form, take place, become a thing, I do want them to make sure everything is better. And I feel like they are doing that, because you think about it, like Frontiers is now a 5-year-old game this year. No, almost, 4-year-old game this year. And we don't even have the sight of the next 3D Sonic, right? It's been about 3 years since Sonic Superstars, right? At the time, we would have gotten a bunch of 2D Sonic games by then. And we have one spin-off with Sonic Racing Crossroads. Like, you can see how much more between, like, in this 2020s era, like, they have been chilled out on releasing a bunch of things. There's obviously been collections and HD re-releases, which that's always going to be the case. You get cool stuff like Shadow Generations, but it does feel like they are taking care of the series a bit more. I think they've heard the feedback. They obviously have a bigger budget and all that. But yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about it, because man, the 2000s for me, right, personally, it was an important time in my life, right? It was, I was 5 years old when 2001 rolled around, and think about that, from that age to 2010, that is a really impressionable time to have on someone growing up with media. I mean, that is basically my 5 years till I was 15, right? Or even, 6 years old to 16 in that sense, right? And that is a very impressionable time to fall in love and be super attached to a franchise, right? And that's why so much people that you guys see online get really nostalgic over the 2000s. Because like Sonic, of course, while, appealing to everyone of all ages, all different audiences, it does have that, it has now landed that area, that weird area where like people that have grown up with it are probably a lot more of the fans than people realize. There are a lot more of the people buying these things than people realize. You know what I mean? And so that's where that big nostalgia and love comes from, right? And obviously, there's been a resurgence recently of people falling in love with like old media, 2000s media. It's like sort of getting a resurgence with stuff like Vertigo Arrow and everybody, leaning onto aesthetic old school stuff when they look at their reels and their Instagram, and their TikToks and look at that old school stuff. Like there's a vibe to that 2000s. It felt like for a while, companies were pandering 80s and 90s stuff in terms of like nostalgia bait. And now it feels like a lot of companies are going for that 2000s time for the nostalgia bait, because that's like when a lot of us grew up. So I'm not saying I want Sonic, to be the 2000s. That was a different time and place in its life, and I'm happy with it. I also, as a person, I like growing up. I like growing up. I like changing. I like seeing, life from, I'm about to be 30. In July. I'm about to hit Unk status, right? But that's okay, right? Every era of my life has its own memories, right? The same way I grew up with the 2000s, with that old school nostalgia. I remember the 2010s. I was in school and university. I remember being in love with Sonic Colors. I remember waiting for Sonic Generations. Hell, I even remember that Wii U era where they announced the deals of the 3 Sonic games coming out. While I wasn't necessarily happy with it, it's nostalgic for me now in a sense of like, damn, that was a different era, the Sonic Boom era. And now I am living what I feel like is an incredible time in my life, which is the 2020s, where I am able to cover Sonic for a living, right? And so I'm so much more attached to these games coming out now, because I'm like, well, I am like extensively talking about these things from their, pre-announcement to all the way up to releasing, and I get to cover them and I get to talk about them. So the 2020s are going to be so special to me, by the time they're done, because I have that attachment of basically covering them, enjoying them with you all and everything. And I hope you guys can look at life like that. Don't look at life as I just want to go back to the thing I grew up with. Look at life as pockets and times of your life where you enjoyed things at the time they came out, and how you remembered those things, and how you'd like to see new things happen, because I love seeing new things. Of course, I'm always going to love that, and everyone's going to love that little shiny bell, right? Of like, ooh, I grew up with that. That makes me happy, right? But there's always something cool to seeing something new happen, right? There's a reason Sonic Frontiers is exciting. It's because it's new. It's awesome, right? There's a reason Crossroads is dope. It's because it's a cool ass new game. You know what I mean? There's a reason why the Sonic movies are cool. It's because it's cool. It's different. It's new. And I hope they continue that. And I would like to see the series evolve forward. But I also do love the 2000s ever so dearly. So guys, thank you all for watching. Let me know what you all think in the comment section below of the 2000s. How important is it to you? You guys are the best. And of course, I'll see you all next time. Peace out.